Hi, welcome to After Hours. I'm Ebi Mohseni, and we are here to talk about democracy, how many kind of democracy exists, and what is revolution. And also, what is the point of view of philosophers and psychology about democracy. I would like to welcome our special guest, Mr. Ramin Joubin, political and psychology researcher. Welcome, Ramin, to After Hours.
Thanks, Mr. Mohseni, and special thanks to the production crew After Hours.
Thank you for being with us, and you're more than welcome. Let's go to the first question about what is democracy, because we know there are different kind of democracy, and every philosopher has a different definition about democracy. In your research, tell us about democracy. What is the definition of democracy at this point of the history, and how many kind of them it has been researched and introduced to the history of the world?
All right. As you mentioned, there are many different views about democracy. The way it's defined in the Canadian Constitution by judges that interpret the Constitution is meaningful participation, so that your participation in politics will get somewhere, will be counted in some way. Now, my proposal, my view, is based on research in psychology, very new research, 20, 30 years old, and based on a very strong line in philosophy, that the meaning of what is meaningful participation has changed, and particularly what I'd like to establish is that a more scientific view does not necessarily put the emphasis on the voting process. And there's a number of reasons for this, and I can start off with a story from Socrates, 2,400 years ago. The story of Socrates, written by Plato, is that he was told by the oracle Apollo that he is the wisest man in Athens. And Socrates was a bit surprised by this, because he said that, well, in the city of Athens, we have lawmakers, we have politicians, we have teachers who claim that they know what is justice, they know how to teach, they know what education is, and he doesn't know anything. Socrates doesn't have any of these professions. So he goes to prove the oracle wrong, and he goes into the city and he questions all the different professionals of that city. And what happens is that when he probes the professionals, he finds that there are contradictions with their arguments. For example, there was someone that was prosecuting an elderly man, and Socrates, you must be very confident about the guilt and your reasoning behind that. And the gentleman is like, well, the reasoning is very clear. It's what the gods want. And then Socrates just simply raised the question, well, don't we always see that the gods want different things? And then the gentleman conceded. He said, yes, the gods do want different things. So that really weakened, that really created a huge contradiction in that person's whole reasoning to act. And in this way, Socrates went to all the professionals, he questioned them, and he found contradictions with all of them. That's how the story goes. And we get what happened ultimately is that really there was a loss of confidence in the city of Athens. And they ended up executing Socrates for the disorder that he was causing. So we have three stories, three lessons we can learn from this. First is the power of questioning. When you question something that has a problematic internal logic, you're going to create disorder, and it's not the questioner's fault. That's the first question, but it's very powerful. It is somewhat of a threat. Second issue is that the need for questioning. We assume that someone is in a profession and that they're for sure correct. But as you said, even in any profession you have different views. And as I will get to, research in the modern psychology research really emphasizes the issue that we are fallible, that we make mistakes from a variety of ways. We have problems in estimating percentages. We think everyone is just like us. And
Absolutely.
and there's a whole bunch of mistakes we make in group behavior. For example, an example of group behavior where it becomes problematic is the Kiddo Genovese case, a woman who in New York was screaming from her apartment, and no one called 911. Everyone can hear her, and no one could call 911. And there's a problem, and everyone rationalizes that, oh, someone else is going to take care of that. So we have these weaknesses in the way we think, and that actually became a big issue in politics with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It became very topical during John F. Kennedy's presidency. And what this shows is that in groups or individually, we are basically prone to error, even in professionals. Somewhere where the professionals, for example, make mistakes, we can look at the research of Susan Birch at UBC. She's worked on a concept called the curse of knowledge. The curse of knowledge means when you're knowledgeable about something, you have a hard time communicating that to people because you've practiced it so much, you're really not mentioning a lot of the points that people want to hear, and you may be making certain assumptions that are debatable across the field. So, and then another example, I'll give you another example while we're at it, is anchoring. Anchoring refers to when we begin a decision. I want to go to a restaurant, or I believe in a particular ideology, and then later on we find a contradiction with that ideology or that decision, or we change our decision. We still have a hard time changing from that original decision to the correct decision. And you can look at the research of Tversky and Kahneman. They're the pioneers in psychology of what's called heuristics and biases, really the fallibility of human beings. And so this really supports the Socratic notion that we should be questioning, we should be educating ourselves before we get involved and really give into a certain political movement or platform. And the third lesson we get from Socrates is the method of figuring out, okay, who's right here, who's wrong. How do we kind of objectively figure out who's right and who's wrong? How do we ultimately gain the knowledge we need to make the right decisions?
Good point,
okay?
yeah.
And Socrates goes halfway, and for 2,400 years almost, they were not sure about how to complete this issue, because Socrates found fault in others, but we really never figured out, okay, so how do we find the answers, okay? And Plato tried to find fundamental principles. Kant tried to find fundamental principles, but they both failed. And so what natural philosophers, so this is a branch of philosophy that looks at morals, moral issues and principles. A majority of them now have concluded that there is really no overlying principle that applies in every situation. We have a concept such as particularism that establishes that every situation is different. And so we have to look at everything in a brand new light, every situation on a case-by-case basis. And what the natural philosophers, starting from Aristotle, 2,400 years ago, competing with the other perspective, the Plato and Kant perspective, we have Aristotle, Hume, and then we have modern philosophers such as Bernard Williams, Cora Diamond, Susan Wolf, and Jonathan Dancy. This line of thought states that we have to learn about the truth through experience, not only being educated, such as understanding our own biases, but going out into the real world and experiencing, participating in stuff, and then experiencing firsthand. Okay, I thought, X, that's my belief. I learned that in a book, but I actually have to go in the real world, work in an organization, and see for myself what's true. And eventually that becomes concrete knowledge. And so this all suggests a different model of democracy. Why? Because first, we can't trust anyone right off the bat. We have to go out and participate in political processes and figure out, okay, how are we going to solve economic problems? Everyone says they want equality. Which method is actually going to achieve equality in what situations, in what conditions?
And it still is not guaranteed.
Yeah, and exactly. Situations change. So we have to be malleable, and we have to be willing to always re-justify our beliefs and change our beliefs. And that's basically a participatory and what I call direct democracy. It's a certain form of direct democracy. Now, we can talk about direct democracy later because there are some misunderstandings or critiques of that, and there are ways to respond to the critiques of direct democracy.
Thank you for this explanation. I really like that. I'm just taking a note, making a note. There is a question came to my mind. You mentioned about the participation on politics. Let's go find out. Tell us about politics. What is politics? What is the definition of politics and politician? And I don't know. It is in our talk. What is government? And what is the job of the government? There are some government. They take the position, and they don't know what is their job. So that brings a lack of governing. So if it's not too far from our focus, please go ahead. So we go first by the politician. Participation on politician.
Okay.
So what is politician and what is the participation in that area? What we are looking at?
Well, what I mean by participation is participation generally in our general lives, but when we're talking about, okay, who's right and who's wrong with regard to a policy, because we have different policies that we could implement to solve a given problem. Health problems, downtown east side, for example, we want to see how we can solve that problem. We have different lines of thought. So what I mean by participation is if we really want to figure out which line of thought is correct, first we cannot trust right off the bat politicians, political parties, political movements.
Why not?
And for the very reasons I mentioned with regard to philosophy and psychology, which I am trying to establish that is a more scientific way of looking at the issues.
Can I ask something?
Yes, of course.
When you say we shouldn't trust,
yes.
Why we shouldn't? And what do you mean by we shouldn't? Because do you mean they're not trustworthy, or that has another meaning below that?
It's that there's 2-3 reasons. One is that we need to be educated ourselves before we make a decision, before we support something. We need to know about that.
Very valid.
Okay, and then second is that the second and third, second is the psychology, third is the philosophy. Okay. Psychology, based on the science of the human fallibility, indicates that groups and individuals are prone to making mistakes.
Okay.
So even if so right off the bat, if someone is stating something, we don't know if it is full of error or not.
Oh, okay. Because of that.
Because of that, and we don't know also if their decision-making process is full of error or not. Get into the process ourselves.
Who should we trust? Who should we? How do you say?
Well, yes, some people might think it's cynical or of me to say don't trust anyone, but that's not exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying starting point, in my opinion, is a healthy mistrust. I believe that's healthy. And we always see the pressure to participate in something, and we don't know, and we don't really trust that. And then people are like, well, stop being so cynical, stop being so apathetic. We have that in different countries. I myself have experienced this or seen this in Canadian society and Iranian society in Iran. And the issue is, again, there's always people trying to pressure you to participate, and you don't really know what you're participating in.
Yes,
so,
very, very valid.
So how do you eventually find the political platform you believe in or the group of people you believe in? That's the only way you can do that is first, being aware of these biases, being aware of these errors, and second, going out and participating in those people's processes and seeing for yourself whether they are full of contradiction
or not.
Participation, my point, is the learning process of it. That's basically the issue, is to participate in order to learn more about, what is the correct policy, when, and the problem when you said what is government, what are politicians, the main issue is based on this perspective, these new perspectives, these new kind of findings, the issue is that politics and government what it should be a little bit more malleable to different conditions. That's because because really we're so prone to error, and because from a philosophical perspective, from new philosophy, natural philosophical perspective, situations change. So we can't use old frameworks in new situations.
Absolutely.
And so both because we make mistakes as human beings, and we have to be able to change our
All the-
decision making.
all the time.
And
All the
second,
time you make
because because of our own fallibility and because of external circumstances, we should be able to change quicker. And that's what politics should be. And that's what I'm saying. If people participate, maybe they can even get involved in organizing some movement in this regard. And there are ways to there are kind of ways to do that.
Is it in our discussion talking about dictatorship as well? Does it help us, or do you think that's another area?
I mean, dictatorship is but how I see it is the exact opposite of democracy. But my definition of democracy is a particular form of democracy that holds a higher standard or higher bar on governments and politicians and systems. So basically, the dictator bar for me is also very low. It's easy to become a dictator. It's hard to become a democracy. So when we say the dictator democracy, I mean we have everyone's in a gray area at the very least, given very new science. And then we have countries that are very cruel, not just dictators, but they're just not even cruel. I mean, they just go way off the radar, and you have massacres, executions, you have just for freedom of thought, you have people being imprisoned just for thinking. Because your thoughts are put on paper, basically. Those are your thoughts. And so you're not allowed to do that in many countries. So dictatorship, in that sense, being the, really inhumane government. Yeah, I mean, of course, you can look at that as well. And basically, you see movements all over the world trying to change into a new democracy. And what's interesting is you see the competing theories of democracy trying to come in.
Do you have any example?
Yeah, I mean, you can see this in Libya and in all the different Arabic countries, Tunisia and so forth. However, I'll use the example of Iran because I have more information about that and more experience on that. Basically, you can see the direct democracy model showing itself and resisting the other models. In Iran, for example, you have a reform perspective and a revolution perspective. Both of them are using the outdated vote representative model. And what really is interesting is that in this day and age, the direct democracy model is showing itself because the people in Iran, though you have very clear revolution and reform lines of thought, the main bulk of people don't trust either of them. And it's a good example because in Iran you had a revolution in 1979 where people trusted a small group of people to fulfill the goals of the revolution. The revolution was social justice goals, for example, equality between classes. And so that minority of people said, hey, we're going to give you that. You guys did a revolution. We're going to give you freedom and equality, based on your own slogans, based on your own goals. But they ended up doing the exact opposite. So they ended up, so we have that experience in Iran where we trusted someone and it blew in our face, basically. So
can I say something? Is it this is very confusing area when we go around the revolution that happened 32 years ago in Iran. Is it because it was like United States paid $125 million to Ayatollah Khomeini when he was in France and made that revolution? When we go back to year, I have to change it to the Western date. It was in our calendar is 12 of Khordad on the year 1342, which it was not a real revolution. I mean, introduction of the Ayatollah Khomeini. It was absolutely something. The extremist.
He was not seen as a leader at that time, and suddenly
he was absolutely not known by anyone.
Exactly.
Even though.
So how did this person? That's a, yeah. So how did this person suddenly? Yes, I mean what the evidence indicates is that there was 3 lines of thought during the revolution. There was a very leftist kind of underlying revolution because the leftists, the social justice activists, maybe one can say, really sparked the revolution to a large extent. And then, but we had other people competing for power for the post-monarchy.
Yes.
And well, the issue is you're in a Cold War time, so from a U.S. perspective at that time, yes, you don't want this social justice leftist perspective that a little bit more tied to Russia and so forth, perhaps, to gain power. So you want to try to suppress that. The liberals were kind of in the middle. Well, the idea is that in Guadalupe, Finland, before Khomeini came and before he was introduced to the Western world, there was a meeting between the Western powers, and then this translated in Paris to a kind of a introduction of Khomeini to the world as the leader. So they definitely had an influence on Khomeini being accepted in the world and in Iran to a certain extent. Now we also have the other element of trust that we have now learned that because Khomeini came to Iran promising the values of the revolution, not what he ended up doing, was exporting a fundamentalist regime everywhere, starting wars and crushing brutally the Iranian people and the revolution itself. So we have promises inside, and that's the issue here, is that we now know not to trust, and it's extreme mistrust that we have for any particular group saying, look, I'm going to fulfill the goals of a new revolution. So in Iran, they want a new country, they want a new regime, but some people want the reformists, some people want a completely new revolution, but you have the main people, bulk of the people, remembering the mistake 32 years ago, or learning about it, and saying, okay, well, I don't trust neither the reformists in their promises, neither do I trust the revolutionaries. So it's a new era of revolution. This is a new definition of revolution, what's going on in the world, that the people themselves have to organize and not trust any particular group. I mean, they can learn about different groups and trust some more than others through that experience model that we talked about. But ultimately, the only guarantee for achieving results is for if the people themselves organize and not trust any particular group.
Okay, I understand that. I appreciate for that explanation.